Brian, it's great to have you with us today. Could you tell me about your emotions, the first emotions after entering Poland?
The main one is being really happy to see how well Poland is doing. I've never been here before, but I'm a student of history. I know how bad things were under communism. Come back 33 years after the collapse, and the country is transformed. This looks like one of the richest countries in the world now. I know the numbers for Poland, which are good, but I say the numbers understate the reality. Every time I go to a country, I'm there saying, the numbers really add up here. I'm very low on Scandinavia. I think they're actually much poorer than the official numbers say. And for Poland, I'm high on that. And of course, it's not just the material riches. The people seem happy. It seems like things are going well. Of course, in the background was the emotion of fear that many people are trying to put into my head. Many people are trying to convince me not to come, to cancel my visit, or at least not take my son. But after 2 years of people living in fear during COVID, I want to live my life. I'm ready to go. I don't want to hold back. Things seem fine. And again, people say this is a honeymoon period right now. It is very touching just to see the incredible compassion of Poland for the Ukrainian refugees. You can see this at every train station. I've been watching it with my own eyes.
What have you seen as a person from a different country coming to Poland and hearing so much about the conflict in Ukraine, about the war?
In terms of what I've seen with my own eyes, I have trouble believing the United States would ever be as welcoming, even to Canadians. If Russia were invading Canada, I think we would let Canadians in, but I don't think it would be like this. There's almost a familial warmth that you're seeing. Not just of course, there's propaganda all over, and you have the pairs of Polish and Ukrainian flags. Just to see regular people in the train stations, but also just to see the faces of the refugees. They're not crying. They're not miserable. Honestly, I've said that they seem to be in good spirits. They've got a better attitude than Americans when their flight gets delayed. That's the way that I describe it.
Especially if you think about almost 2 million right now today coming to Poland in about 2 weeks. It's like an influx of a crowd. This is exodus.
So, often when I'm writing about immigration, people say, "Oh, it just can't be done. We just can't move that number. You can't add 1 million people in a year." Poland's added 2 million people in 2 weeks. So what are you talking about?
We don't have any kind of FEMA camps or special relocation places.
Yeah. It really is where there's a will, there's a way, and most of what goes on when people say, "Oh, we can't possibly do this," is they're just making some lame excuses. They don't want to.
You know that most of those refugees right now, they are living in private houses.
Yes.
Welcome. They are guests in private houses. This is like a charity bomb.
Yeah,
so it sounds like a libertarian utopia to some extent.
Yeah, it is a level of charity that honestly I just find hard to believe, but I really am seeing it with my own eyes. It's not just primarily the government of Poland. I know the government's paying people some very token sums to do this, but when you hear the numbers, it's like, I don't think that's why they're doing it. I think it's because there really is this outpouring of compassion for the people fleeing Ukraine.
But also there are some other voices popping up here and there as usual when it comes to immigration, because let's be frank. At some point, the state will step up, and it's going to be a blow to spending. This is going to hurt a little bit, and there are people even from, let's call it like libertarian / classical liberal oriented societies that are saying after Milton Friedman that it's impossible to sustain immigration if we have a welfare state. What's your take on it?
Right. So, in my book, Open Borders: The Science and Ethics of Immigration, I actually have an argument with Friedman. Of course, he's dead. I did actually meet him and got him to sign one of my books when I was a young man. But anyway, the main thing to know is what Friedman said is a gross overstatement. It's one of the most wrong things Friedman ever said, because he said, look, you cannot simultaneously have free migration and a welfare state. It's like you cannot fly to the moon by flapping your arms. It's not like categorical like that. It depends upon the numbers. And almost no one with an opinion on this has even looked at the numbers, much less actually tried to add them up. I don't think Friedman ever did it. When I wrote the book, I did try going through all the work of people who have done the numbers. So for the United States, the numbers generally look quite favorable. Looks like actually the immigrants that we get are, in the long run, a net fiscal positive. That means that the cost of the services that migrants use is less than the cost of all, or the amount of taxes that they pay. And of course, this is also counting their descendants as well. You got to count, their kids going to school. That's a cost. But you also have to count the taxes their kids will pay when they grow up. So I mean, honestly, the way that almost everybody handles this is emotionally. If you like immigrants, the numbers are going to be great. Yeah. And if you don't like immigrants, this is just totally impossible. This is going to bankrupt us. And like everybody, if you haven't actually taken out a calculator or a spreadsheet, just be quiet. Like you don't really know what you're talking about. You are just pretending that a philosophy is a way that you can go and answer a quantitative question. In terms of what's going on in Poland, I have not seen the math. I'll just say in general that the U.S. numbers are good. Those are the ones that have been studied the most. The one country in Europe where it seems like the net burden of immigrants is quite negative is Norway, because they have so much oil money per person. Anytime you have a fixed resource that you're dividing amongst a population, and it's a large resource in a small population, then additional people, whether they're immigrants or children, are going to wind up looking bad. But for all the other countries, I'd say it's a much closer call. It is likely that European countries, the math is a bit more unfavorable than for the US, but not nearly as bad as people tend to think, because the US actually is a very large welfare state. And on the other hand, European countries actually have a lot of taxes, right? And especially European countries have a lot of taxes that everybody pays. The US system is in some ways more progressive than Europe when you count all taxes, because we do not have a VAT or a national sales tax.
So would you say that this is like a blessing in disguise? Because I absolutely know that there are, that Ukraine right now has much bigger problems than Poland. Like there's like no comparison. So would you like present that situation as a blessing in disguise to some extent, that we are actually winning this when it comes to what? Demographics, when it comes to economy?
Well, so there's demographics. You've got a birth dearth in Poland. So if they wind up staying, then of course this is going. Then you've got a whole lot of kids that are here that will grow up to be Polish workers, Polish taxpayers.
We don't know yet, because this is just a
right.
transitional situation.
Here's the thing. So if everything works out for Ukraine, then it's likely that most people will go back. In which case, this really was just a Chernobyl episode, and the long-run effects for Poland will be negligible, good or bad. If the war works out badly, then people are going to be staying, and there's going to be a lot more, and this is where the work that I do in the book actually matters. So yes, there's the effects. There's the effects for taxpayers, which in the short run almost certainly negative, because they show up and they start receiving government benefits, and they're not going to be working very often yet, and also there's a lot of kids going to school. But on the other hand, over the longer run, people do get jobs, kids grow up, and then all of the benefits that you get from having more births, you wind up getting through having more immigrants instead. In terms of the economic effects, these are the ones that people discuss the least, but actually I think they are the most significant. Important to realize that by official measures, Poland is about the average Pole is about 4 times richer than the average Ukrainian, or 4 times as rich as the average Ukrainian. And this is not just some kind of weird charity thing where like the Polish employers are nice and Ukrainian employers are mean. This comes down to productivity. A Pole produces a lot more than a Ukrainian. What we know from a lot of research on immigration is that almost all the difference is in the location rather than the people. You can move those Ukrainians to Poland and they can very quickly be at least near the Polish level of productivity, which means large increases in the production of the world. Think about it this way. So right now, Poland and Ukraine have roughly equal populations, both countries around 40 million, but Poland would officially have about 4 times the production per Ukrainian. So if you were to go and move all the Ukrainians here to Poland, then it is quite realistic that you could double the production of Poland. But furthermore, you would almost double the combined production of Poland plus Ukraine. That's the real shocker. It's not just that you're moving production from Ukraine to Poland, you are multiplying the Ukrainian production as you move it, because Ukrainian policy, Ukrainian economy, Ukrainian politics are so much more functional, right? And in terms of the economic effects, it's almost like adding another Poland to the GDP of Europe and the world.
Okay, so let me think about it, because we are talking in like accountants that would move people from A country to B country,
Yes.
and just like sum it up. Your father-in-law was from Romania.
That's right, yes.
And he was an engineer in Romania.
Yeah,
And
you know,
when he came to
like
United States-
electrician, but sort of, you know,
Electrician,
yes,
yeah.
yeah.
When he came to United States, he was a janitor, as much as I know. So
That's right.
How is that productivity wise? You know, how is that a positive
Right.
net?
Well, so the whole
situation?
story is he was a janitor for a couple of years while he learned English, and then he went back to his chosen occupation of being an electrician. And then, yeah, so during that period where he was a janitor, actually probably was more productive as a janitor in the U.S. than as an electrician in Romania. If you're wondering, like, how could that be? Remember, the main point of any service, such as being a janitor, is to save other people's time. Right, so when a janitor at an IT firm, that means that the IT people don't have to go and take out their trash; they can focus on their job. So once you realize the point of a service is really to save the time of other people, saving 5 minutes of Bill Gates' time is a lot more valuable to the world than saving 5 minutes of my time. So it really is quite likely when he came to the U.S. and saved the time of the more skilled workers in the U.S., that he was actually adding more to the production of the world as a janitor than he did back home. But then, in any case, that only lasted a couple of years until he learned the language, and then he's back in his chosen occupation, and then multiply his productivity many times. But I mean, here with Ukraine and Poland, it's a very different situation, because from what everyone has told me, it is really easy for Ukrainians to learn Polish.
Yeah, it is.
Right,
But
so,
the big
yeah.
counter-argument, which is not my counter-argument,
Yes,
but
yes.
I need to ask this question,
Yes.
is like, all right, so he came from Romania to United States, and he stopped being an engineer in Romania. So Romania is, you know, is not really getting anything from, or Romanian folks are not really getting anything from him being a janitor and then an electrician in the United States.
Right. So normally it is very common for migrants to go and send home a lot of remittances of money to the home country, and that way people who stay behind wind up sharing in the bounty. Under communism, there are all kinds of problems with doing that, and actually you might want to pretend you don't even know the people that left the country. An optimist might say, well, all those people leaving helped bring down communism, and maybe, I don't know, probably put a little, I mean, I am on Team Gorbachev of saying, look, everything was about Gorbachev. If you had, if Putin had taken over instead of Gorbachev, then I think the Soviet Union would still exist today. Yeah, Putin would have been too young. Putin would have been a little young, but you never know.
This type of person, the KGB kind of person. In my opinion, it was the VHS tapes that killed communism eventually.
Yes, you know Chuck Norris versus communism.
Yeah, exactly.
Very fun
story.
documentary. Look, that was important, but yeah.
documentary.
Oh yeah, yes, right. But I mean, I am of the mind that if you just when you have a brutal dictatorship, as long as you are sufficiently evil, you can almost always maintain power. Gorbachev's problem is he wasn't evil enough. He was someone who had some mercy, some pity. If you again, of course, it can't just be one evil guy at the top. There has to be people. There have to be people under him who are willing to cooperate with him. But normally, if you've got a system like that, you can just handpick some really awful people at the top, and they pick other awful people for the middle, and they pick really awful people for the bottom, and then you just set up a system where of terror, and you can maintain your iron grip.
So you were a keynote speaker on a panel yesterday, and there was this returning notion of welfare state. Right?
Yes, of course.
Almost in every question.
Yes,
It's
yes.
it didn't really look like a libertarian organization, right? Because everybody was speaking about like a social minimum, universal basic income, welfare state, things like that. But this is a recurring subject that I wanted to ask about. The political part of this. I'm pro open border, and even if there are some incommodities, it doesn't really like. I don't need to muscle a lot to get this argument.
There are those who would strain out a gnat
Yeah.
and at the same time swallow a camel. That's biblical saying that I think often comes to my mind with immigration. Someone will say, look, there's going to be $10 of extra social spending, so we can't let this person in. It's like, you're talking about trapping a person in Haiti because they were born in the wrong country.
Right?
Yeah.
You can please stay calm and die in your bomb shelter in Kharkov, because or else we can afford free communication tickets or something like that in Warsaw. Now that's not the argument, of course, but we talk about Ukrainians coming to Poland and other countries, but there are like 2 million Ukrainians right now, or 4, because we also have like 2 million Ukrainians who came here for the last been coming here for the last 10 years, and right now we have an extra influx of almost 2 million today, so quite a lot. But also, I'm hearing voices that, people from Texas should not let people coming from California, you know this argument, because they want to vote the same thing make them leave California in the first place.
First of all, you always want to get the facts straight. If it turns out the facts are confused, then you can say, like, we don't really need to have the argument that you were planning on having. I have a friend, Ben Powell at Texas Tech, who does research on this, and he looked at the numbers and he said you can actually see that people who are not, so in Texas, people who are born in Texas are less Republican than people who are let me put it this way. So among Texas voters, people who are born in Texas are less Republican than people who are not born in Texas. So on average, migrants into Texas are more Texan than the Texans that are already there.
Because they know the
yes,
story.
Yes, and they're going to a place that is the way they want it to be. Right. It is easy to, you might say that's just impossible to leave because I was in Austin and that wasn't true in Austin. Look, Austin is a very democratic city. Actually, in fact, it's so democratic that this rule could still be true, actually, because if the natives are 90% Democratic in Austin and the immigrants are 80%, it's still less than that. I mean, so I only know what Ben Powell said for all of Texas. I'm not sure about Austin. Anyway, so first thing is just double check that in fact, whatever the pattern is that you are claiming is true is even true. That's step one. And then, step two is, all right, so maybe it is true. So right now in the United States, it is true that immigrants are a lot more likely to be Democratic than natives. Right? So plausibly that does push policy in a Democratic direction, although it's one where you really want to step back and say, all right, yes, well, there's many different kinds of Democrats, many different kinds of Republicans. Parties have to go and try to appeal to the audience they actually have. So this is where I'd say you don't want to just look at party identification, you want to look at issue views. And there you see, in the United States at least, that immigrants, on the one hand, they are more economically left-wing, but they're also more socially right-wing, which means that the actual effects in terms of the general direction they're pushing the country is much more complicated than what most people assume. It is not true that...
the ones that should be complaining should be libertarians.
Yes, that is a fair point. Yes, which just take us back. Say
they don't.
Yes. There's a lot of complaint about immigrants voting for the welfare state. Not many complaints about immigrants being socially conservative, although that's true too. Though the meaning of that is changing a bit. So perhaps the oppression of social liberalism has actually gotten to the point where you may say, look, social conservatism now almost just means tolerance rather than brainwashing of people all the time. But anyway, so there's that. But much more importantly is when you look at the magnitudes of the differences. Right? So while these differences are real, I have done some of the work on this. Nevertheless, the difference is the kind where you do need to take out statistics to actually see it. It is not the kind of night and day difference that people are imagining. Right? It's not like immigrants are Stalinists and Americans are anarcho-capitalists. Again, it's more like a very marginal difference. And then you just say, gee, we're talking about keeping someone trapped in poverty in Latin America because he might be a little bit worse as a voter. Then again, other things is that immigrants just have low rates of voter turnout. So if you're worried that they vote badly, be happy they vote rarely. And then finally, one other plausible effect of immigration on the welfare state in particular is that there's quite a bit of research saying that as the immigrant share of a country rises, that native support for the welfare state goes down. And why? Basically, people do not like supporting outgroups. Right? Does not mean that they are racist or xenophobic so much as they have reduced love or affection. Right? They don't think of them as part of one very tight-knit national family. If you are a communitarian, you may say, oh my God, this is terrible. But libertarians should be delighted if we undermine this idea of society as a family because it's a very oppressive metaphor. If a society is a family, well, do you think your parents are going to give you permission to go and take hallucinogenic mushrooms or climb Mount Everest or do any other risky thing? Your parents don't want you doing that kind of stuff. Why? Because they love you. They love you. They want you to be safe. They want to take care of you. What a free society is based upon is not love, it's respect. Saying, look, that's not my choice, that's your choice. You do what you want with your stuff. I'm going to do what I want with my stuff. So that's why I say that for libertarians, immigration really is a win-win where not only is there the greater freedom to migrate, but there's also the reduced obligation to help strangers.
I would like to step into that "they took our jobs" argument.
Okay.
They took our job!
They took our jobs.
Was Donald Trump, even remotely
Right.
reasonable in saying that they bring the worst, they're going to take your jobs, and that's a pretty bad idea to open the borders?
What I would say is that it's a half-truth or a quarter truth. If there are immigrants that come in and compete in exactly the same occupation that you are in, of course that's bad for you.
They took my job!
When we let in all these foreign-born professors into the United States, that's bad for me. If we could expel every foreign-born professor from the United States, I could get a job at a much higher-ranked university, have higher salary, that would be good for me. However, important to remember, there's another side of this, the consumer side, the people that are actually buying the products, and for them, it's actually much better when there's competition, which then you step back and you say, so it's immigration of people that compete with me in the labor force, the people that sell what I sell, those are bad for me. But people that sell what I buy are good for me. What's the way that I can add all this up and come to some reasonable net estimate of what's going on? And this is where I do come back to what I consider the number one principle of economics. If the secret of mass consumption is mass production, the way that you get a society rich is by having high levels of production. That is the key. Therefore, whenever you look at an economic effect and you see, well, some people are gaining, some are losing. So yes, I know that always happens. What is the net effect on production? And that's where I'll say, look, immigration has an incredibly positive net effect on production because the whole idea is that you move people from places where their productivity is low, like Ukraine, to places like Poland where their productivity is higher. It is exactly the same logic as technological progress. So, well, on the one hand, the internet went and made it easier to go and handle travel. On the other hand, it destroyed the jobs of almost every travel agent in the world. Some good, some bad. What can we say? What we can say is definitely good overall because the production of the world dramatically increased. And if any are wondering, but what about the people who are out of work? Guess what? They find something else to do, almost always. Of course, if you were 2 months away from retirement, then probably you don't find another thing to do. And if that was your retirement plan was selling your travel agency to somebody else, then your hopes have been dashed. But a society that focuses on no one can ever lose from any kind of change is going to be an impoverished, miserable, and stagnant country. And in fact, this is a really good way of thinking about one of the main problems of communism. So there's American social scientist John Halterwanger who's analyzed why does productivity grow? And he looks at very detailed information from millions of firms. The punchline of his work is that the main reason why, sometimes the only reason why productivity grows is attrition. The really good firms survive and grow, the bad firms shrink and die. That's one of the main, in fact it is the main source of economic progress in the world, is the good firms expanding and surviving, the bad firms shrinking and dying. When I read this research, I actually asked Halterwanger, so this seems like a really good explanation for what was so wrong with communism. Because under communism, government firms don't die. There's a government monopoly. If it doesn't do well, they just put more resources into it and you see what happens.
In communism, people are more important than companies, so you
Yeah.
can't let them die.
Yes.
That's it.
Late communism.
Late communism.
Yes, Stalinist communism was the other philosophy of people are garbage and let them die by the millions. Who cares? We have to build communism. Doesn't matter if people are dead or alive as long as the Red Army is mighty. Yes, very important to understand. It literally was one of the most bizarre transitions in all of economic history from life under Stalin, where people are dying by the millions, to 1980s communism, where we pretend to work, they pretend to pay us. Quite different, really.
So if you have a box that's producing enchiladas and tacos and whatever Mexican food you can imagine, and the food just pops out of the machine, everybody's happy. If you open the box and there's a Mexican boy making those dishes, then suddenly everybody's
that's right.
shocked that he's taking somebody's job, right? So
of course, there's always Luddite voices against technology as well. They're never as loud or as powerful because on some level, almost everyone realizes technology is basically a good thing, and it would be bad if we got rid of it and bad if it stopped improving. And sure, you might lose your job, but on the other hand, you also get all of the bounty created by the technology, so don't forget that. Yet trade and immigration as a form of trade works exactly the same way, and this is something where people's reaction is much more negative, even though economically speaking, it's really the same thing.
So, could we speculate that Donald Trump was saying that out of sheer populism, and he even doesn't believe that? He's too smart to
It's a good question. I mean, my view is here's the thing. I know many people as smarter than Trump who also believe this stuff.
All right.
My dad's a PhD in electrical engineering. He's a very smart guy. He's never read a book on international trade in his entire life, never read a book on immigration. Certainly he's never read anything I've written about it. But he is convinced that the solution to all of America's problems are to do a naval blockade of Japan, or really now all of it, China, all of Asia, and a Berlin Wall at the Mexican border, and then America can go back to being great like it was in the 1950s. The thing about Trump is that I agree that he is an unusually opportunistic man. So like he was a Democrat before. He switched parties, and somehow this fact about him has not been used to destroy his reputation in the Republican Party. You might think, you would say, look, he's just Johnny-come-lately, how can we trust him? Somehow, through the power of personality, he became Mr. Republican. Bizarre. But what we can see about him is that while he has changed his mind conveniently on many issues, going back to the 1980s, he's always been a populist on trade and immigration. He's always had these attitudes, which are, of course, extremely common attitudes. They are emotionally appealing attitudes that almost every human being starts with, and it takes work, often constant self-monitoring, to avoid falling into these ideas because they're impulsively very appealing to normal humans.
If we speak about a country that surrounds itself with walls and cuts every economical tie you can imagine. So probably right now we're talking about Russia,
Yeah.
not the United States. So let's talk about the sanctions for a moment. I'm confused because today in Poland, all we hear is that we need to impose those sanctions, European Union, United States, and this will make Putin change his mind. And I'm quite skeptical about it. Which right now, if you say that out loud in Poland, you're a Russian spy.
Yeah.
Like from the get-go, like that. RT journalist, whatever. You're just like paid by Putin. Because during the peacetime and prosperity, we hear a lot about sanctions that do not really work, right? North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, Iraq in the 90s. They caused misery, but they actually never made any political change. So is the situation different with Russia today? In your opinion?
I'd say the situation is so extreme that in a way it's a test of whether the problem is just that the sanctions weren't extreme enough, or whether they just don't work at all. This is a general problem with social science. You try something, it doesn't seem to work. There's two inferences you could draw. One is this is ineffective. The other one is the dosage was too low. Right? Same thing with the vaccine. Give someone a vaccine, it doesn't seem to help. Well, maybe the vaccine is ineffective. Maybe you just needed to give them 10 times the dosage and tell, be careful, right? Don't. All right. It is a very good question is what's going on. So what's happening to Russia is quite extreme. Betting markets do say that Putin has a 20% chance of not being in office by the end of the year, and I think that means dead, actually. There are a lot of powerful people in Russia who, especially oligarchs, the much hated and despised rich people who just want to make money. Those sound like the kind of Russians that we can deal with. They sound great, right? The kind of Russians, they're like fanatics, nationalists. They're terrible, but just rich, corrupt guys. Salt of the earth. Like if only they were in charge, unlikely that this kind of thing would be happening. So the optimistic scenario is right now there's some rich guys conspiring the military to take Putin out. I think that's unlikely, right? Betting markets think it's unlikely, but a lot more likely than normal. This might have something to do with sanctions. No, this is a different story than the people rise up, which basically never happens. This is the rich guys conspire, which does sometimes happen. I think I probably am on your side in thinking that it's just not very likely to work. I mean, the reaction is obviously very emotional. Like when you say, let's get McDonald's out. It's like, well, you think that's going to change their mind? They're like, oh my God, we have no McDonald's. Now let's go and pull our troops out. I can't stand to not have McDonald's. A lot of it emotional, a lot of it symbolic. I mean, as to whether the sanctions that actually crash the ruble, crash the stock market, crash their GDP, as to whether that is enough. I mean, I think it's unlikely. I wouldn't my default is that it will not work. And I agree, these other examples of very strong sanctions, if there is a brutal government, they can just say, hey, let's let the people's standard of living fall rock bottom. We'll keep eating caviar and having a great time. Sure, we can't take our private planes to France anymore. Fine, we'll go to China instead, and we'll go to some other countries that will allow us to be there, and we'll spend our money there. It's hard to say, but yes, I'd say almost everything that I know about sanctions comes from reading Richard Hnenya, and what he says is two things. First of all, sanctions are highly effective at destroying economies. Right, so a sanction is not a slap on the wrist. Oh, bad boy! A sanction is economically devastating. So I think if I remember his estimates are something like true full-blown UN sanctions that will depress your GDP on average by 2.5% per year cumulatively. Mm-hmm. So every year, expect another 2.5% decline. U.S. sanctions alone, more like 1% per year. But again, that adds up. But at the same time, yes, very little sign that sanctions actually change the minds of the oppressive governments. Furthermore, what he says is the cases where they work are basically ones where you have some moderate, reasonable demands and you keep talking to them. The kinds of sanctions that don't work are ones where you say, we hate you, you are terrible, you're tyrants, massive sanctions, and we're closing our embassy, we're never going to talk to you again. It's like, well, they don't even know now what they have to do in order to get the sanctions off. Probably the best way to make it clear would be to say, look, these are sanctions and they remain in place until you do the following things. Right? If you say, look, the sanctions remain in place until the troops are withdrawn and then the sanctions go away, that would probably be the best way to make them effective. At this point, sanctions, usually once they're in place, they basically just stay there. Even when the government changes, often it takes a year or two before the sanctions get removed. At this point, I think if I were Putin, I'd be saying, it's now a sunk cost. Maybe I made a mistake, but it's not like I can just pull my troops back and set the clock back to a month ago. So might as well just continue with the current plan and say, well, too bad. Too bad everyone hates us now, but it's not like we can make them unhate us.
How does it look? How does the situation with war in Ukraine looks from American perspective if you're based in the United States? Because I've heard a lot of conflicting, at least signals. Sometimes you can even have a feeling that a part of libertarian theater sounds a little bit pro-Russian on that conflict.
Definitely. Of course, there are some libertarians who are anti-war, and of course, many libertarians are anti-war. But once you're anti-war, it is very hard to avoid the temptation just to say the other side is good. During the Vietnam War, I wasn't alive, but I guess I was alive at the very end. But sure, opposed the Vietnam War does not mean that I had any sympathy at all for the North Vietnamese government or for the Viet Cong. They were terrible. It would have been much better if the U.S. had won completely. That would but given the situation, it really was just a mass death, and then eventually the North Vietnamese went anyway. But there were a lot of anti-war protesters. In fact, I think most anti-war protesters were just pro-communist, and they wanted the communists to win. And they're not really anti-war at all; they are pro-communist. This was, of course, the whole Soviet bloc peace movement. Right? There's this old joke. Comrade, will there be a war? No, comrade, but there will be such a struggle for peace that not a building will be left standing. Right. So I think so. Anyway, it is when you oppose a war, it is very easy to just give in the temptation to say the other side is good, or both sides are bad, and equally, and you both fine. Well, every government's bad, but equally bad. Equally bad. Come on. All right, that stuff is pretty silly. But in terms of the general U.S. perspective, there's a lot of pro-Ukrainian symbolism in the United States. I'd say at Poland, it's probably at say 8 times the level of symbolism in terms of flags you're seeing, statements. There was no one in the streets of the U.S. screaming against Putin. I did see that here. Just a guy just...
That's the usual.
Putin.
That's the usual thing. That's what we do.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So that's like a cultural thing. You might just get in the street and start screaming.
Shouting. Yeah, exactly.
I was asking, is that guy drunk? No, he's just an angry Polish guy.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. That's different. Obviously, for Americans, there's the basic problem of most Americans had never heard of Ukraine before. I think that's on a minimum could not locate Ukraine on a map. Probably, if you just did a test where you gave Americans 5 countries, 4 of them made up, and then 1 is Ukraine, and they say, tell me which country is real, I think that maybe 40% of Americans would have correctly answered that quiz. That gives you an idea. So it's not very real for Americans. It's really for Americans. It's on the other side of the world.
Country somewhere in the world that's America trying to save.
Yeah,
and
there's a lot of that.
Iraq.
I mean, so like here are the things that are different emotionally for Americans. I mean, so Zelensky, he just is a lot more charismatic to Americans than any Afghan leader, the Karzai or somebody like that.
Yeah.
To Americans, Karzai just looks like some weasel. And it's like, is it really fair to judge a leader just by looking at his picture? Of course it's not fair, but that's how human beings are. Is you look at a guy in a t-shirt with muscles, and there's that kind of thing Americans like. Obviously, Americans love a guy who stays in the capital city when it's getting bombed and does great. So I mean, I think there's hardly any human being on earth who doesn't feel better about a leader that stays there when the bombs are falling than someone who runs in terror. That's very basic human emotion. Like you're supposed to be our leader, but you're more concerned about protecting yourself than you are about saving your country.
You see, what I'm hearing, what I'm getting is like an echo from American media. This is not, I'm here in Poland, really close to Ukraine right now, and I think like it almost looks like American government wants to have a war or a serious conflict with Russia, and it's not a new story. It's like they're trying to build some tension, and right now they have a great excuse to start another conflict.
There's a little truth to that. I mean, even among people that are Russia hawks in the United States, if Putin were replaced with some neo-Gorbachev type, I think a lot of that would calm down. There's always about 4 years where they're saying, I don't believe it. No, he may act like he's a liberalizer, but he's not really. Gorbachev eventually, even the hardest line, anti-Soviet people said, all right, something strange is happening here. When the Soviet troops pulled out of Afghanistan, that was when even the biggest hawks just said, all right, I can't believe my eyes, and something has changed, something very important. And then when Gorbachev did not invade Eastern Europe in 1989, this is where really like anyone that was worked on the issues at all realized, all right, this is really quite shocking and unprecedented, and I can't keep saying exactly what I've been saying for the last 20 or 30 years of my career. I've got to admit that there are some changes. So, I mean, definitely there are people in the U.S. who are just hungry for some kind of a conflict. I mean, until 2 months ago was more China than Russia, honestly. People say like we've got to go and do something here, right? And it's one where, of course, you can always point to them and say, they're doing some terrible things. You can point to your own country and find some terrible things you're doing, but that's not very fun. Right? Not fun, to look inwards and say we're not perfect. Let's fix ourselves, rather than focusing and something that we could actually probably fix, rather than focusing on other countries. So there definitely is a kind of person in the United States that really does like the idea of standing up to another country. But I mean, I honestly do think this is fairly situational, where if Putin had just kept his head down, I mean, just been a oppressive dictator who stayed within Russia, I think that the amount of American desire to do anything about it would have been quite low.
There is a lot of hate right now on Russian people, Russian citizens who are voting for Putin. They are supporting Putin, and this is something that I don't really like.
Well, I mean, it's natural to some extent, but that doesn't mean that you can't try to move the dial one way or another. I mean, the United States is a great example. During World War I, we had a fanatical anti-German crusade, to the point of renaming things. Yes, Liberty Cabbage, and we don't have German Shepherds anymore. During the war. Now, then they came back. During World War II, the U.S. Party line was basically that the German people are being ruled by these horrible tyrants, and they're victims too.
During the Second World War.
During the Second World War.
During the German camps for Japanese.
Yes. Well, World War I. The German people are evil. World War II, the German people are victims too, although it doesn't mean we're not going to carpet bomb them into oblivion. In World War II, on the other hand, the Japanese people are themselves evil. But the interesting thing is that there's 2 world wars, and honestly, I think it's probably fair to say the Second World War was supported more by Germans than the First World War. and yet the attitude of the United States was very different. And yeah, it is a much better way to go about it, to focus on the government is the enemy and the people are not the enemy. I mean, if ever there was a noble lie, the noble lie of the people of the other country are not really our enemy, it's just the government. But it's not exactly a lie. It comes down to, look, if we could just decapitate the government and replace them with some reasonable people, it's not like regular people in Russia would be buying tanks and going and invading countries on their own. Like, that is the solid core of the insight that it is not the people of the country that are the enemy, it is the government of the country that is the enemy. Yeah, it's, I mean, honestly, in terms of actually winning people over and getting people that are that are powerful but unhappy in Russia to switch sides, right? Like it would really be helpful for them to have a credible sign that all will be forgiven as soon as you get rid of the top and reverse policies. And this is not this is not a deep-seated hatred, but rather it's an objection to these specific actions by these specific people, right? And we're like, our door is always open. Whenever people ask me, like, how can libertarians make their arguments more effectively? My answer is, look, the arguments are great. We're doing great on arguments. Let's just stop trying so hard to improve the arguments. We've already fine-tuned them. We polished them. Let's work on our attitude. Let's try to be really friendly to people. Make friends. Like step one of convincing anyone of anything is to become their friend. Well, you don't go to a stranger and say, "Here, let me read you my argument." The way that you convince people is first. You connect with them on a human level, then you talk, right? And of course, you have a conversation, but you're friendly about it. You say, "Oh, these are my views. What do you think?" You laugh. You don't try to convince people through intimidation. You don't try to trick people. Just be friendly and honest. Like, does this always work? Duh, of course not. But in terms of what is your best bet of dealing with other people? Yeah, like big smile, big handshake. Warm personality. Non-judgmental. These are accepting. These are all very good traits for persuading people, and yeah, I think they work really well internationally as well. As you're directing them, saying, look, we are not angry at anyone except for the people that are behind this. We would be delighted and thrilled to see a change in policy here, and even to say, look, we know that not everyone in this country is behind this. We know that many people at the top are not behind this. And we are ready to deal with you the second that you can go and get the upper hand. All the sanctions come off. If that were your message, there's obviously no guarantee. And if Putin saw this, he might say the Americans are right. Let's find all these traitors and kill them. This is what Chairman Mao was doing throughout his entire rule of China. Is there's capitalist roaders here? I know they're here. They're here. Where are they? Deng Xiaoping. He's a capitalist roader. This guy. But here's the amazing thing. After all of the massacres and slave labor camps and purges of Mao, he dies, and you know what? Mao was right. The Communist Party was full of capitalist roaders, and they got power. So don't forget that. That's a very important lesson.
Late 70s, it took a lot of time.
Yeah.
So
Well, not long after he died. Mao dies, and then like the amount of time from slave labor camp to new dictator of the country is stunning. You're just like, what? The guy goes from prison to supreme dictator in a few years. And his enemies, including Mao's wife, they go from sleeping with the dictator to prison for life. Like that. Wow.
Yeah, it happens. And having seen what you're seeing in Europe, especially in Poland right now, all this, grassroots reaction to this influx of immigrants, isn't that like a story out of a libertarian comic book to some extent that nobody would believe normally?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely like to believe it, but I am stunned by what I've seen here in Poland. Again, as I've seen this with my own eyes. I've been at the train stations, just seeing the refugees and just seeing the attitudes of Poles. I mean, I'm not, you can see it really everywhere. And then just step back and say, millions of Poles are taking refugees right into their own homes. They're not being put into camps. I mean, honestly, what I would say is, the real dream scenario would be Poles are also accepting Russian refugees, accepting Belarusian refugees, and saying, look, the people want to get out. they're the ones that hate the regimes that are there. Yeah. They are just as much victims of what's going on as people that are fleeing the war. I mean, like we know that there are thousands of Russians who have stuck their necks out and gotten arrested. They're in like horrible Russian prisons now because they didn't believe in what the regime was doing, right? And to say, look, anyone like that, anyone who doesn't believe in this, anyone who's got skills, who just wants to live their life, come here, you're welcome. We'll give you, and you're not our enemy, you're our friends. We understand that you're in a tough position, and we're not going to go and blame you for what your dictator did.
So to end on a positive note, and to quote Rem Emanuel, who said that there is no crisis that should be left unused or something like that.
Yes.
We cannot afford to not.
Yes. Never let a good crisis go to waste.
Exactly.
Never let a good crisis go to waste.
So how could libertarians in Poland, United States, whatever, use this crisis?
Yes. I mean, I think the obvious one is to say, people claim that it's just impossible to take this many refugees. They say, it's just impossible to go. They can't be absorbed. It's just beyond human ability. And to say, look, Poland has done more in 2 weeks than most countries on earth have done in their entire histories. And what's the difference? It's not that Poland has some extra ability. It's not that Poland is superhuman. It's that they actually had resolve. Right? If you actually, it's not a question of what you can do. It's a question of what you want to do. And Poland has shown that it is actually, totally doable, right? To go and absorb millions of refugees. I mean, honestly, I was expecting to see horrible tears and misery at the train stations. That's not what I saw. What I saw was people who were in good spirits and being welcomed, and despite the fact that they're coming in massive numbers, people are handling it very well because they've got a positive attitude and are actually and want to make it happen. They're not making excuses for why. There's no possible way that we could do this. Thinking a previous wave of refugees from the Middle East, North Africa, I think that was more of we don't really want to, and therefore we can't. You can. It's a matter of don't want to. So I think that's a big part of it. A lot of the benefit of the libertarian talking points that you can get really come if the war goes badly and then the Ukrainians stay here or come in even greater numbers. Then we will be able to come back in 10 years and say, see, they're integrated in the Polish economy. Polish GDP has increased 30%, say. Totally plausible, actually, as a result of all this. That's the kind of thing. Say, look, here are countries that did good by doing well, or did well by doing good. The countries that did well by doing good, where they open their hearts to refugees, and the country is doing great because of it.
Okay, so let's hope it stays this way and the war ends as soon as possible.
Yes, I mean, I think that's ultimately the best thing. Although, the talking points will be better if Ukraine empties into Poland, and then you see, and the Polish economy doubles. That will be where you'll see, no, it can't be. It was, but yes, obviously you don't want to have a war go horribly so that you can get a debating point. You guys have been a fantastic crowd. I really appreciate the warm hospitality. Thank you very much.
They took our job!